The Curses and the Covenants, A History Weaver Mystery, Book 2. By Connie Worden. Read by the author. Chapter 27. I was grateful when the dragging day drew to a close, at least near enough to start getting ready for bed. Ma always turned in early, so I got her settled and had a long, hot shower, trying to wash the tension down the drain. I wasn't sure I was tired enough to sleep, and I didn't want to toss and turn alone with my thoughts. I usually read myself to sleep at night. I eyed Julia's journal on my bedside table. Did I want to go there tonight? No. But then I didn't want to go there anytime. The sooner I got it over with, the sooner it would be done. And I needed to get on with it and get it handed over to the police before I got charged with withholding material evidence or something. Julia was artistic, I discovered from the opening pages. Then the ink drawings continued throughout the book, interspersed with her writings. The pictures were a jumble of disturbing images that I couldn't quite untangle into any kind of meaning. Mostly designs and patterns that seemed dark and frightening somehow. But I could tell she'd had talent. Her writing was about the same. It wasn't written as a typical teenager's journal. It was written almost as poetry, cryptic, non-rhyming poetry. But I sensed a depth and artistry to her words that I wouldn't have suspected from any of her classwork, or any of my sessions with her. I sighed and gritted my teeth to try and wade through the pages, looking for any relevant meaning. None of the entries was dated, so it was impossible to know when she'd written what, or if it had any connection to any of the events going on in her everyday life. Every so often she'd have an entry in plain prose, but these seemed to be in the form of fictional stories, written in the third person. The stories weren't typical. There didn't seem to be a plot, more like series of short vignettes. They must have meant something to Julia, but I wouldn't have known how to find their meaning. A recurring theme were two words that cropped up in both the loose poetry and the narratives. She made numerous references to the Urim and the Thummim. The Urim and the Thummim. Where had I heard those words before? They were vaguely familiar. Something biblical, I thought. It struck some sort of chord in my memory when the idea came to me. How could I find out? We had no Wi-Fi at Ma's house. I had no data left on my phone, and the home computer was in Ma's room. I didn't want to disturb her to search the internet for the information. Ma had Bible reference books in her bookshelf in the living room. Maybe one of them would be helpful. From my basement bedroom, I crept up the darkened stairs in my bare feet, using my phone as a flashlight so as not to wake Ma. I ran the light over the bottom row of her books, where she kept her Bible study books. On one end of the shelf, being used as a bookend, there was a wooden box that stirred an old memory. Forgetting momentarily what I'd come for, I pulled the wooden box off the bottom shelf and opened it. I played the light across all the little carvings as I took them out of the box one by one. We hadn't had the nativity set out since I was a child, but now that I knew the history of it, I was fascinated to see it again. I remember how I'd loved it when I was little and my parents would set it up for me at Christmas time. Some of the paint was wearing off the clothing of the little animals, but they were still in remarkably good shape, considering their age, and the fact that I had played with them for hours on end when I was a kid. I suppose the fact that they weren't allowed out of their box except for the Christmas season had spared them. I marveled at Oliver Adamson's skill in carving the little animals of the nativity scene. They were just as I remembered. Mary, Joseph, and the baby Jesus were depicted as bunnies, the little Jesus bunny resting in his manger cradle. I remembered how I used to love to take him out of the manger and use him as a bunny baby for my Barbie dolls. The shepherds were a fox, a wolf, and some other canine creature, possibly a coyote, as I now knew that all had chosen the animals that lived in the Beaver Row area to carve for his child. Had the irony of the predatory shepherds watching over the sheep been intentional, I wondered? 2 birds were dressed as angels, and a sheep and a deer were apparently the non-humanized animals allowed to be around the manger. The Magi were a mouse, a squirrel, and a bear, holding their gifts for the baby. The mouse and the squirrel must have been bringing the frankincense and myrrh, if memory served correctly, because the bear was carrying the gold for the Christ bunny. The irreverence of the Christ child being a bunny suddenly struck me. Wasn't the point of the incarnation God becoming man or something like that? Turning him into a bunny would seem to defeat the purpose of the nativity depiction. But likely, Ole and Evie Adamson hadn't looked at it that way, as I never had up until this moment. Now that irony also struck me. It was a nostalgic discovery, but it wasn't at all what I had come to find. I replaced the little animals in their wooden home and put it back on the shelf. I'd gotten distracted, but I'd better get back on track if I was going to get any sleep that night. I needed to know what Julia meant by the Urim and the Thummim. There on the bottom shelf, next to the wooden box, was exactly what I needed. A Bible dictionary. And a big fat one. More like a Bible encyclopedia. That might do the trick. Once back in my room, I learned that the Urim and the Thummim translated roughly to the lights and the perfections. They were pieces that were set in the garments of the high priest of Israel, possibly precious stones that were used in some way to discern the will of the Lord for the nation. There was only guesswork as to how this process worked. How had Julia accessed any knowledge of the Urim and Thummim? She didn't come from a church-going family. Maybe she'd learned about them from some of her fantasy reading or her internet activity, I surmised. Seemed like the kind of thing that might crop up in the mystical genre that had been Julia's standard reading fare, I guessed. Armed with the dictionary's information, I reread Julia's references to the Urim and the Thummim. The lights and the perfections. These concepts had significance for her, but what significance? I began to notice that the references all seemed to be pointing in the direction of secrets and lies, and how they needed to come to light. The injustices needed to be righted. The lights and the perfections seemed to represent to her the revelation of hidden truth and the rectifying of the evils that were exposed by the light. But there were never any specifics. Ironic, I thought, when Julia had been on very distant terms with truth and justice herself. Gold and silver, the Urim and the Thummim, they reveal what people really are, she'd written. That line seemed significant. I jotted it down on a notepad by my bed, but, after pondering it for a few minutes, was none the wiser as to what had been in her mind when she'd written it. The cryptic story that surrounded the line didn't go far to enlighten me. Maybe it was too late at night, and I was too tired to tackle the riddles of Julia's tortured mind just then. I struggled through till about a third of the way through the book, straining to understand anything from it, when I was happy to notice that my eyes were starting to droop and the book was slumping out of my hand. I thought I might not be able to sleep at all, so I was grateful to feel the sleep coming on. I closed the book, replaced it on the nightstand, and clicked the lamp off. Exhausted physically and emotionally, I was asleep within minutes. August 28, 1898. The burning question of last entry has not exactly been answered, but it has opened up my mind to new ideas. I have to say that I'm coming to see the God of my fathers, the God of the Bible, a little differently than I have in the past. In fact, perhaps the God of my fathers, of my traditions and early training and teaching, seems different to me now than the God of the Bible, that I'm coming to see through these pages for myself. Although I believe the creeds and the catechisms to be correct, learning them by rote as a child had the effect of rendering them lifeless to me. I'm finally coming to understand their meanings. Besides the Bible, I am exploring this new world of the mind, my mind and its opening to new ideas, through my father's commentaries, and hearing the wisdom of others' learning, making the Bible more understandable to me as it became to them, treading in the footsteps of giants, as it were. In all my reading, I find myself circling back to the first 3 chapters in the Bible, over and over. Not surprisingly, I suppose, when the mention of the curses in the 3rd chapter of Genesis seems highly relevant to my own life and circumstances, and my own questions just now. In starting to read the book from the beginning, it was the word cursed used in Genesis 3 that caught my attention and held it. I must say that I am coming to see those curses differently, having lived through my recent tragedies, than I had ever seen them before. There is much to be explored here, and I think I want to do some of that exploration in writing in the pages of this diary. I feel a need to read and think a little more, even to be able to form my thoughts into comprehensible words and ideas, even just for my own sake and the sake of this diary. So, till another day, dear diary, I'll bid you adieu for now.